And finally, in the top five, the United Nations says that the number of civilian casualties in Afghanistan has hit a new record for 2015, surpassing 11,000. The figure shows a 4% increase compared to 2014. According to the report, more than 3,500 Afghan civilians were killed last year, while nearly 7,500 others were injured. 1 in every 4 casualties was a child. The figure was 1 in 10 among women. At least 103 Afghan civilians were killed by foreign forces in 2015. The 9% rise was attributed largely to a deadly U.S. airstrike on a Doctors Without Borders hospital in October. According to the UN, nearly 59,000 people have been killed or wounded in Afghanistan since 2009. Our correspondent Faiz Khurshid joins us now to tell us more about these numbers. Faiz, is the rise in casualties because there's been a rise in attacks, or is it because the security is not able to handle the violence that's being incurred, and as a result for casualties to happen?
I think both. This report released by the United Nations shows that how grim the situation was in this country in 2015. As you pointed out, a large number of civilians were killed. Children and women have suffered the most. And it comes as Taliban insurgents have increased their attacks in populated areas, and the bulk of the casualties have been attributed to terrorist groups like the Taliban. And these terrorist groups continues to attack civilians in populated areas. They continue to use civilians as human shields when they attack Afghan security forces. What is surprising for the majority of Afghan people is that Afghan forces have been also found responsible for around 40% of these casualties. Yes, it shows that all warring parties were responsible for civilian casualties, including NATO forces in this country. Their airstrikes have also caused civilian casualties. What's now very disturbing for the Afghan people is that there's still no assurance that such casualties would be prevented. Now, we are in 2016, and the Taliban have already stepped up their attacks. They have warned that there would be a deadly spring across Afghanistan. They want to attack Afghan institutions. When they strike, of course, civilians are killed and wounded. But in 2015, something different happened in this country. Around 140 Shia Muslims were also killed. They were kidnapped and then killed by these terrorist organizations. And these repeated attacks have created fears among local civilians. And this has prompted thousands and thousands of young Afghans to flee their country and go to Europe for a better life. Now, all eyes are on the Afghan government to prevent civilian casualties, talk to the Afghan Taliban insurgents to stop using civilians as human shields. And the Afghan government is now trying to reach to the Taliban leadership. The Afghan government is trying to seek the help of Pakistan, China, US to bring a political settlement in this country, but I don't think that it would happen overnight.
Well, they recently did have talks. What was the result?
I'm sorry, would you repeat the question?
Sure. Recently there was a round of talks with the Taliban, if I'm not mistaken. What were the results of those talks?
Well, Taliban are not willing to lay down their guns. They have very high demands. They first want the Afghan constitution to be amended so that it can reflect the Taliban ideology. And the Afghan people don't want that to happen, because they think if Taliban are given jobs in the Afghan government, the little progress that has been even made over the past 14 years would be lost. Now Afghans have a parliament, they have a government, they have freedom of speech in this country, and Taliban don't like to see women go to college and work. It's not acceptable for the Afghan people, but it's still the Afghan government is trying to talk with the Taliban militants in a bid to convince them to lay down their weapons. But the Taliban also want the complete withdrawal of all American forces, which I don't think would happen anytime soon.
Thank you for that. Faiz Khurshid, correspondent there, talking to us from Kabul.